discovered Off Balance, a book by Matthew Kelly at my local used bookstore. And it was $6. And I thought, yeah, sure. That looks interesting. It was a short little read. It was a short little book at only about 180 pages, I think, or 125 pages, something like that. Um, Looks like it was about 138 pages. There you go. And it was an interesting book. Here's the thing about this book, and here's the reason why I've never heard of it. It's because this guy wrote this book as a sort of an ad or a method to increase his consulting work, right? Like lots of people write this sort of stuff. I don't think it's inherently a problem. I think it's fine. I've done this myself actually with the book that I wrote. Is that he works as a consultant and he would like people to hire him to sort of help on the things that he consults about in terms of work life balance and work satisfaction and team satisfaction and healthy outputs and inputs and these sorts of things. It's still an interesting book. And I think that there were a few things in here that are worth bringing up and mentioning. It is, in large part, a book that you think that it is, where it asks you questions about, like, well, are you satisfied with your life right now? And sort of these very deep philosophical questions that a lot of people just either shut down at or don't have very good answers for, or even if they do, don't really know how to articulate the answers that they have or why they have the answers that they have. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, I like my life, I guess. I was like, "Oh, I got, great family or whatever." And people kind of trail off and they've clearly never thought about it before. It's the sort of thing that you can't ask people big, deep questions like that and expect people to give you a thoughtful, deep answer unless they have previously done the effort to think about it. And most of the time, most people have not done that, which is fine and totally acceptable, but it is what it is. He opens this book with a little parable about a fisherman in a small Mexican village and an American businessman who goes to this same village for a vacation. And I won't read the whole thing, but the summary of this is that uh, the fisherman goes out, catches a handful of fish from his modest little fishing boat, and then the businessman watches this, and the fisherman comes back into shore and gets ready to go on the rest of his day. And so the American businessman says, you know, how long did it take you to catch those fish? And the fisherman says, not very long. Was there something wrong with your boat? And he says, oh no, in 13 years, I've never had a problem with the boat. And so the American, a little perplexed, asks the fisherman, why don't you stay out there longer and catch more fish? And the fisherman smiled and said, well, there's plenty right here for my family right now. And some of the fish we can eat, and the others we can sell or trade for some other things that we need. And the businessman says, but it's not even lunchtime. What do you do with the rest of your time? And the fisherman explains, is like, well, I like to sleep late. I wake fish a little, mostly for pleasure, and I play with my children, take a little nap, and spend time with my wife, and I have dinner with my family in the evenings. And while my children are sleeping, I stroll into the village where I sip some wine and play guitar with my friends. And of course, the businessman looks at this and says, but you could fish longer and you could catch more fish. And the fisherman continues to ask, but then what? And so the end result of this is that the businessman with an MBA from America has helped this little villager in Mexico create this fishing empire that involves hiring hundreds of people and owning canning factories and making millions of dollars and living and working in a skyscraper in New York City and having sort of total dominion over his domain. And at the end of it, as the fisherman asks, but yes, but then what will I do? And the fisherman says, with great exacerbation, is like, I don't understand. What would I do? And the American says, well, then you can move to a small coastal village and you can sleep late and you could just fish for the pleasure of fishing. And in the afternoons, you could take a nap with your wife. And in the evenings, you could have dinner with your family. And then you could stroll into the village and sip wine and play guitar with your friends. So the parable of this, or the moral of this parable, is that a person has a perfectly happy, legitimate life. And American culture, particularly, would encourage us to sort of extract this for all it's worth and sort of grow it into this large mammoth empire. Uh, and as he gets into the book in a couple of chapters, the author, Matthew Kelly, kind of comes back to it and says, you probably don't actually want to live like the fisherman, that you might feel like you want to live like the fisherman, but you probably don't want to live like the fisherman because the fisherman doesn't have, health insurance or dental insurance, and he has bad teeth, and his body aches because he's getting older, and he doesn't have health care. He doesn't have electricity and all these other sort of things and amenities that um, legitimately most people probably don't want to live without, like central heating and air, and not wanting to spend most of their time trying to think about their next meal and catching the food for their next meal, right? Perfectly valid situation. Uh, the other thing is that I think most Americans probably could. They probably could decide. It's like, you know what? I do want to live like the fisherman. Most Americans that have any level of assets at all probably could get away with it. You probably could sell your house and with the equity in it, run off and spend that money on, a small cabin someplace and be on your way. And if you don't own a house, then you probably do that with maybe some savings that you've got, or that you could probably figure out a plan within about 10 years, almost at any age, even if you were in your 20s or 30s, to be able to achieve that kind of lifestyle if you really wanted to. And it sort of gets at what is the best way to live. And despite the sort of the title of this book, where it's, off balance, getting beyond the work-life balance myth into personal and professional satisfaction, I don't know that there was really a whole lot in here about work-life balance. Um, this book was written at a time when I think that the idea of work-life balance was, I don't know, maybe he comes from a different lineage of it. I mean, it was published in 2011, so a lot's changed in the United States since 2011. But I get the sentiment of it, and so he asks you to sort of think about the questions of what do you like about your life as it is today, and what don't you like about your life as it is today. Do you feel trapped by any of the things that you don't like about your life today? And if you were told that you went to the doctor next week and you said that you were dying and that you had 1 year to live, what would you do for that year? If you inherited $10 billion, what would you do with the rest of your life? Most of us aren't going to inherit $10 billion. I get the idea behind the exercise of it, but it's not practical. Um, a person could legitimately learn that they're going to be dying soon. As he actually writes, that he kind of came away with a cancer diagnosis at one point and sort of shifted his thinking. I assume that he's since beaten that because I think he's still living. So good for him in that regard. And I think that the premise of this book isn't about work life balance in the way that we in 2022 think about work life balance, about sort of drawing hard lines of like, when I'm done at 5 o'clock, I'm done with work for the day. It's about finding satisfaction. And he says that living a more satisfying life is possible, and experiencing a deep sense of satisfaction, both personally and professionally, is possible at the same time. And that you don't have to sacrifice personal satisfaction to have professional satisfaction, and vice versa. Again, if you listen to any of my other prior episodes, I tend to approach statements like that, and I think about them from the standpoint of an Amazon fulfillment center worker, and saying to that person, "Is like, you can have personal and professional life satisfaction. Perhaps doing it at an Amazon fulfillment center probably isn't it, right? I don't know that too many people really love that kind of thing. I'm sure they're out there and good for them, but I think logistically that is just not a it is just not a great avenue for most people most of the time for this sort of thing. He actually questions this notion about how is the best way to live. Uh, he says every great civilization since the beginning of time has concerned itself with a single question: how is the best way to live? This is the primary question that the great philosophers of every age have grappled with. It is the question of every culture, country, generation, and individual consciously or unconsciously wrestles with. It is also the question that the whole work life balance conversation of the past 20 years has been centered upon. But most important, is a question that you and I grapple with in a deeply personal way. He says the way that people approach this is very telling, and it is of disturbing importance to note that the present culture has virtually no interest in pursuing this question, which I think is fair. He says we seem more interested in how we want to live than we are in discovering the best way to live. Likewise, we are much more interested in developing self expression than we are in developing selves that are worth expressing. And I love that line. He says personal preference has triumphed over the pursuit of excellence. We want what we want, and we feel entitled to what we want. And I think that is absolutely true. I think that there is certainly a generation of people, increasingly new generations of people, that sort of are much more interested in presenting a version of themselves that they want people to perceive as interesting than is actually interesting. And I highlighted it too because for years I would talk with clients that by and large operated in some pretty boring businesses, right? Like they had good businesses. They did fine enough work and they, were sustainable in the extent that they could pay their employees and they were nice people. And it's just that they did kind of boring work, right? It's like, every electrician and every realtor doesn't get to be the most exciting person in the room, right? That just is, right? Like we've sort of encountered these kinds of businesses in our lives. It's like insurance, for example. It's like, yes, that's important. We should all have insurance. But it doesn't make it a particularly exciting thing. And sometimes when I would tell people, they would be like, well, we should be on Instagram. And I would just look at them and I'm like, what is why? Like what are you going to do in that space on a continual regular basis that is both useful to you and entertaining to other people? Because that's what it is that you were there to be entertaining to other people in those avenues. No one goes on Instagram to learn about insurance. Nobody cares. That will flop. That will not go anywhere on social media. It just won't, right? And I'm sure somebody out there is going to be like, well, I can do it, Justin. It's like, fine, have at it. I'm telling you, like, I can almost guarantee you that anybody listening to this episode, if you use one of those services, you are not following a bunch of insurance companies on Instagram or wherever, right? Because they're kind of boring businesses. And that when you have these sorts of boring businesses, I would tell people, it's like, well, have you considered being more interesting? And they would just kind of stare at me blankly because the answer to that, of course, is no. Like they do what they do and they're comfortable with that and they know they're not very interesting, yet somehow they want to present themselves as being something that they're generally otherwise not. And it has been annoying to me for so long that so many people do that. I hope that I don't also do that. I mean, maybe I do to the extent that I don't put every thought and feeling that I have on Twitter. Uh, but at the same time, it's like I definitely present things to people in a way that I want to encourage them to like what I'm doing, I guess. So I guess in that regard, that we're all kind of in that same lust of hedonism, which is actually another thing that I had highlighted here. He says, hedonism is not an expression of freedom, it is a passport to enslavement by a thousand cravings and addictions. And in the end, it produces not pleasure, but despair. The third philosophical mark of our age perfectly complements the greed of individualism and the lust of hedonism in the demise of human character. Accompanying these other modern creeds, whose central tenets are what's in it for me, and if it feels good, do it, is the creed of minimalism. The minimalist is always asking, what is the least I can do? And I want to take a moment here and clarify. It took me a little bit to kind of wrap around the context of what he's talking about here. He's talking about minimalism in literally what he's saying, which is what is the least that I can do, not in the minimalist as in I want to decorate my room sparsely, right? That's a different kind of minimalism. He says, and he writes, a minimalist is always seeking to exert the minimum effort and receive the maximum reward. Consciously or subconsciously, people everywhere seem to be asking, what is the least I can do and still keep my job? What is the least I can do and still get reasonable grades in school? What is the least I can do and still keep my marriage alive? What is the least that I can do and stay physically fit? And what is the least that I can do? Dot, dot, dot. Minimalism is the enemy of excellence and the father of mediocrity. It is one of the greatest philosophical diseases of our age. And minimalism has infected every aspect of our lives and society. And tragically, it is also one of the philosophical diseases that is eating away at the corporate culture. It is within the philosophical realms of individualism, hedonism, and minimalism that most people make the majority of their decisions every day. It is therefore not difficult to see that managing people is becoming increasingly difficult, and individualism, hedonism, and minimalism all lead to decreasing levels of satisfaction in a person's life. With all this in mind, we should not be surprised that most people are not able to design a sustainable work life balance framework for themselves. And again, like a lot of other points in this book, I don't know that I understand how this relates to work life balance and some aspects of things. I think my interpretation of this is that in the context of like marriage, as he gives us as an example, we should pursue our marriages or our relationships, whether that if you're not married, with a certain vigor and relentlessness that creates the most maximum amount of value for all parties involved, right? And that when you're sort of a minimalist about it, what you're doing is you're just sort of trying to skate by on the least that you can do to keep that marriage or relationship intact. And as a result of that, you don't ever get to develop any kind of the richness that comes with really good relationships or marriages. I think another way that you could imagine this is cooking. Imagine that you cooked something and you didn't put any seasoning or salt in it, and most people would be aghast at that, and maybe rightly so. And if you did that, you'd be like, well, I have met the least that I can do here, which is that I put the ground beef in the pan, but I didn't season it, right? And so, in that regard, I was a minimalist about it, and I just whether it was because of you were lazy, or you just forgot, or you didn't care, or it was you just didn't want to, or whatever it might have been. Uh, Unless you've got some serious sodium issues in your diet, most people would look at that and be aghast, right? And so that is my interpretation of how he's arguing about minimalism and how it harms people and how it harms our communities and sort of the philosophy and our way of life. And I thought it was a unique description. I hadn't heard it before. I thought it was apt, and I think that there's a lot of value to that. He also talks in here about in a chapter titled "How Satisfied Are You?" Um, he says there are some who will say in this modern age we can work smarter. Uh, it's true, but so can everyone else. And some of the people who make up the everyone else are willing to work smarter for 50, 60, or 70 hours a week. Don't get me wrong, I am not espousing a 60-hour work week. I am just pointing out the reality of our times. And he says, kind of in the context leading up to this, he says, I get to work with some of the best companies and the most incredible business minds in the world. I love being in the room, and the truth is, you don't get in that room by working 40-hour weeks. If you don't want to be in that room, that's okay. But if you do, regardless of what it is you do or want to do, chances are it is going to take more than 40-hour weeks to get you in the room. Let's face it, a 40-hour week is the baseline. So I think it's fair to assume that excellence and market dominance are found somewhere beyond a 40-hour week. I didn't invent the 40-hour week, but it is what it is, the standard. And to ignore that baseline reality is to detach ourselves from that reality, and that never leads to success. Um, I highlighted that because I've never seen anybody in print. Again, the book was written in 2011, so it's not that old. I have never seen anybody in print who made such an argument. I think it's a compelling argument. I don't think he's wrong. I don't think he's right either. It is what it is. I understand it. I get the point behind it. I just for a book that espouses how to find work-life balance and then to tell people it's like, well, if you would like to have success in whatever, you're going to have to do more than 40 hours at work in a week. I just don't understand. I don't see how those things square up. uh, I don't see how you have professional depth in your life with either like your marriages or your relationships or your family or your kids or whatever if you're pushing 50, 60 hours a week. I think most people, when I hear that, what I gravitate towards is that most people are pretty bad at estimating how much time they actually spend doing whatever it is they're doing. And that most people think that they work more than they actually do. And studies have long confirmed this that if you ask people, it's like, well, how much time do you spend doing X, whether that's watching TV or sitting at the office? People typically overestimate or underestimate in weird ways that make them fit something that they wish they were or weren't. It's like if you ask somebody, how much time do you spend watching TV in a given week? 90% of the time, they'll come back and they'll say, like, only like 1 or 2 hours, when in reality, they watch like seven, right? Or 8 or 10 or whatever the number might be. Because they don't want to seem like a person who watches a lot of television. On the flip side of that, are you ask people, how much time do you work in a given week? And they'll tell you 50, 60 hours. And in reality, it's more like, 34, right? Or something much less than that because they want to seem like, at least in our culture, because we perceive this to be more valuable, that they're always working harder than they actually are. There are certainly people out there who are on all ends of those spectrums and all different fashions of things. Uh, but when I see something like this, where someone's saying, like, well, in order to have professional success, you're going to have to work more than 40 hours a week. I listen to that and I say to myself, well, maybe 40 hours is actually enough if we were smarter about how we allocated those 40 hours. If we didn't spend time sort of noodling around on the internet and sort of wasting time here and there and doing our Wordle every day, that uh, maybe if we sort of really focused in on how we were supposed to achieve what it was that we were supposed to achieve, you could fit more in, I think. And so it, I highlighted this in this book because it struck me as the sort of thing that was so opinionated, which I kind of like, right? I like that it's so um it's so on point with like, nope, this is it, right? And it does feel like the sort of thing that a white businessman would say, right? Doesn't that sound like something that you would hear from somebody who would like come into your high school and tell you that life isn't all rainbow and puppies and stuff like that? But you know, there it is, for better or worse. Uh, you know, there was another section in here about personal and professional lives. Uh, he says the personal and professional lives of your employees are intimately linked. This is perhaps the scariest reality a manager or business leader can face. Sure, it starts off very innocently, but it can quickly escalate to a place that most people are not comfortable going. It can very quickly end up in a place bordering on being politically incorrect. Never mind that it may be true. Let me give you some examples. He says an example that works out on a regular basis is likely to be or excuse me, an employee that works out on a regular basis is likely to be more engaged and more effective in his or her work, not to mention less of a drag on the company's health insurance. The company cannot force an employee to work out, but if the employee does, then the company benefits. Now consider this: an employee is having marital trouble. There is a real cost to the company for that marital strife. An employee's wife dies, leaving him to raise their three children alone. And you better believe this is going to affect his ability to contribute at work. An employee's father gets sick and he or she becomes part time caregiver. The impact on their work is inevitable. A child or spouse develops an addiction, and this brings major stress, and you can be sure that that will negatively affect a person's work too. An employee's pet gets sick and needs several visits to the vet over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, and this will affect the work in the company. I read again. I read that and I just sort of like, well, you're not wrong, but man, what a jerky kind of way to say that. I don't, yeah, people's lives are messy, right? Like all people's lives, these things happen to everyone. This sort of reminds me of arguments about health insurance in the United States, right? Where it's like, well, we don't want nationalized health insurance because I don't want to pay for all the obese people or the people who, do stupid things, and, skydivers and cliff divers and people who, play with fireworks on the 4th of July kind of stuff, right? Because I don't want to pay for that. And it sort of rejects this reality that is the reality that we will all get old, right? And so I look at this and I'm like, yes, I recognize, and I think he admits, obviously, part of this argument is that yeah, people will encounter problems. People's pets will die. People will know people who have other mental or physical health issues, or they themselves will develop mental or physical health issues of all varying kinds of stuff, right? But to approach that as only a thing that is of importance or value to a company just strikes me as almost borderline inhuman. And again, kind of gets away from this notion of how to find work life balance. It's like I don't know that this is the way you find work life balance when you approach all of your employees as potential liabilities. I did read that and think briefly about all the places that surely try to engineer that out. And there's been lots of ways that companies have tried to do this over the years for all these various reasons. Why women for a long time did not get hired for positions because they just assumed they were going to get pregnant. And then if they were pregnant, they weren't going to be in the office and therefore they weren't driving value and they were just a cost suck, right? Like these things have been real and and continue to happen in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think you could probably find places today that insist on, by and large, only hiring certain kinds of people in certain kinds of classes or groups, whether that's based off of race or religion or whatever, just because they want to avoid the hassle, I guess, the trouble, the effort of sort of learning or understanding or being empathetic towards other people. And I don't know. I feel like these work life balance discussions pretty fail pretty miserably when you're in those kinds of environments there. But uh, he goes on to say with some more tough love back here is like the work life balance discussion has failed to adequately make clear that you cannot have it all. Um, that by and large we refuse to accept this, and you can see how this kind of pattern could lead to a great deal of frustration, or at the very least, a real insanity if taken to the extreme. That just because we started talking about work life balance and encouraging it does not mean that people can all of a sudden have everything. I cannot play tennis and golf at the same time. The finite nature of a certain period of time requires that I choose to play tennis or golf this afternoon. I cannot do both at once. We have to choose between many options in deciding what to do on any given day or in any given hour. The other way this idea plays out is that excellence in any field requires that we miss out on other things. If you want to be the best tennis player in the world, you're going to have to sacrifice a great many other things in order to achieve that. Hopefully, you will decide with a clear head that the things that you're giving up are less important than becoming the best tennis player in the world, and that success has always required and always will require sacrifice. And if success were easy, it would be common. It is difficult, and that is why it is rare. More people have the talent than you would think. Few are willing to make the necessary sacrifices. I think that's true. I don't disagree with that at all. This is how this book kind of oscillates between sort of a stone cold conservatism of things, or a, kind of a cold blooded capitalist approach. Like it's almost as if it was written by Mr. Burns. And sometimes it also gets into the realities of just how I don't know, just how people have to make their own decisions about certain things. It's just unique to me how these sort of community decisions and personal decisions kind of interact and flow around with each other. And I feel like he's dancing around both of those. I think he's trying to make this point that individual decisions and individual people kind of create larger overall communities, and the health of one kind of impacts the health of the other, and vice versa. I just don't think he does a very good job of explicitly stating that at some point or another. It seems very read between the lines to get that. Uh, and I think that that's part of what makes this book interesting is that you can read it, and if you have sort of a Mr. Burns mentality behind it, or if you have a Bernie Sanders mentality behind it, you can find lots of things to enjoy here. So the last thing that I want to mention is chapter 5 here. It says systems drive behaviors. And he says Napoleon once said, "Those who fail to plan can plan to fail." And if this is true, and I believe it is, then we need to consider the implications of this idea on our business, to be sure, but also in our lives. Do you have a life plan? How much time do you spend planning different aspects of your life? Of course, many people react violently to this type of talk, defending their much prized spontaneity. I am as much a fan of spontaneity as most, but not to the extent that it robs us of passion and purpose and drains satisfaction from our lives. We need a plan. Um, and he goes on to talk about back to the fisherman and asking, what kind of life do you want to live? Do you want to live the life of that fisherman, or are you more content or inclined towards a business that is, the guy who opens the canning factory and runs a big fishing operation and runs, a multi-billion-dollar international company from skyscrapers in Manhattan? And that he goes on to say systems drive behaviors, and there are good systems and bad systems. If the system is not designed properly, it can drive the wrong types of behavior. Take, for example, the recent macroeconomic meltdown that was facilitated by the housing crisis in the United States. The very simplest explanation is that the system that drove housing in the boom was a bad system. It was a bad system because the desired outcome had been defined in the wrong way. The system was set up based on a desired outcome of selling a lot of homes, and the system should have been set up based on a desired outcome of people keeping the homes they bought. And in this system, commissions were paid to mortgage brokers when the homes were sold. But if the homes went into foreclosure, they didn't have to pay the commissions back. So they didn't care if people were lending money to that were at credit risk. Or perhaps they did care, but not nearly as much as they would have if they had known that they would have to pay back their commission and perhaps also a fine in the event the bank foreclosed. If the system had been set up this way, far fewer bad loans would have been made. Interesting observation there. Obviously, timely for what it was in 2011, I'm sure, because of the housing crisis being in 2007. I think that this book is so short that it's almost you could almost read it in the bathroom. I think sometimes that if you are a person who likes to be reflective. And if you've been like me and you've been reading a lot of these books lately that are talking about focus and attention and how we can sort of increase our depth and our lifestyles and improve ourselves in various different ways, this book is a good complement to that because it's seems to me like a much more uh, conservative angle of things. It seems to come at things from the standpoint of, you know, you're not going to have it all, that this is hard, that you're going to have to sacrifice and sort of that you're going to have to do all the things that we know that we're going to have to do or that a person has to do in order to achieve greatness or excellence in whatever it is that they do, but that a lot of books fail to adequately stress or even mention at all. So anyway, the book is Off Balance: Getting Beyond the Work-Life Balance Myth to Personal and Professional Satisfaction by Matthew Kelly. It's a New York Times best-selling author of two other books called The Dream Manager and The Rhythm of Life. I have not read those books. I'm also inclined to think that it seems like everything anymore is a New York Times bestseller. I don't know how that's possible. But at any rate, you'll like this book if you like something that's informative, a little challenging, reflective on yourself, and that might also challenge your preconceived notions about your life. There are lots of little quizzes and questions in here that you can ask yourself. I tend to skim over those because I tend, at least not in the moment, to be in the mood to do those sorts of things. I did highlight a few of them in here. They are very good. I think as questionnaires go, it's sort of giving you a score within the confines of 15 or 20 questions, that they're pretty good, and not a bad way to spend 5 minutes some morning, quickly measuring, kind of where you are, maybe coming back to them every 3 months or every 6 months or so and re-asking those same questions to sort of cross compare. Uh, Particularly if you can sort of put a plan or a strategy in place that enables you to make real effort at changing your life in the way that you want it to.